Welcome back to C Scott Dev. I'm Scott, and I'm going to teach you CSS. HTML is the language we use to define the structure of a web page and fill in the content, while CSS is the language we use to style that structured content. Let's jump right in. Here I pre-made a wireframe for our layout. Let's figure out how we're going to build this in CSS. Outside we have the window, which represents our browser window. Inside that we have a rectangle, which represents our container, an invisible element that will constrain the width of other elements. Next we have our header, then our navigation menu. Here we have our content, and of course our footer. To help us figure out which elements to build, let's label each item. First we have our container. Note the hashtag. We use this to reference an element on the page which won't repeat. Next we have our header. We use a dot here to indicate a class, something we can apply to any element in order to give it style rules. Then we have our nav menu, which we'll call menu. And then next our content. And finally, our footer. Okay, let's get started. Let's create a folder on the desktop. I'm going to title mine Learn CSS, but you can call it whatever you want. Next, I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. Once that's open, the first thing we'll do is create our HTML document, and then we'll create our CSS document. Our HTML document will be index.html. Let's use Emmet to generate our HTML skeleton. Now let's call it Learn CSS. Inside here, let's use our wireframe to build out each element that will make up our web page. The first item is the container, so let's make that. The container wraps around the entire set of inner elements. Note that it uses an ID, and we'll have to reference this using a hashtag from CSS in order to apply styling rules. Now let's build out the rest of each of our elements. First we'll create the header. The header has a class name of header, and inside that we've got an h1 element that says, "Welcome to my site." Below that is our nav menu, which is a nav element that we've applied the menu class to. Within that, we'll use an unordered list of links to create the actual elements we see in the wireframe. We'll create the first one for home, and then copy it down to fill out the link placeholders for about and contact. Next is our content, which will utilize the main element. We'll apply the content class to it. To fill in the filler text, I'm going to use a shortcut here to generate it and then pare it back to just the paragraph length I need. Let me toggle word wrap so we can see the full paragraph. Finally, we have the footer, which uses the footer class name. Within that, we have our copyright notice. Note the ampersand copy semicolon, which will tell HTML to render a copyright symbol. Let's save our progress so far to see how it compares to our wireframe. Hit Command S or Control S on Windows, and then drag our file name over here onto the browser window to open it in a new tab. Note how we have all the elements in place, except the header. Let me add that in really quick. Let's refresh and see how that looks. Much better. Now let's jump into styling. First, let's create our style sheet. Let's create a new file and call it style.css. Once that's created, let's link to it from our index.html. The link element has some required attributes: the relationship, indicated by rel, the path to the file, indicated by href, which will link to style.css, and the type, which is text CSS. Also note, link is a self-closing element. Let's save this and start adding some style rules to style.css. Before we start, let's split the window so we can see index.html and style.css at the same time so we can keep an eye on what we're styling. First, we'll style our container. Because we want to style it based on the ID, we'll use a hashtag. Inside, we'll specify a max width property at 1200 pixels. And to center it on the page, we use auto margin on the left and right, using the margin left and margin right properties. Let's save that and see how it works. We don't see any difference until we expand the browser beyond 1200 pixels, and that's where the width of the container stops. Note the container is also centered on the page as intended. Let's align these three windows side by side so it's a bit easier to see what we're doing. Now let's begin to style the header, the nav, the content, and the footer the same as we have in our wireframe. Remember, in our wireframe you used a dot to indicate a class name, so let's reference the corresponding class name for each element by using that dot. We can also reference multiple elements with a comma-separated list, like so. Grouping the classes like this will mean that all elements using the styles in this list will get the corresponding style rules applied to them. Now let's start adding some rules that all these elements have in common. The first is the background color, which we'll fill in later. Next is the border, which I already know is 2 pixels wide. Note that I'm using the shorthand for a border definition here, which is width, style, and color. Let's grab the colors to replace X and Y with directly from the wireframe. Here I'm using a plugin called ColorZilla to sample the colors directly from the wireframe. ColorZilla gives me back what's called a hex code. And to learn more about hex codes and how they work, read the link in the description. We'll do the same thing here with border color. Let's save and refresh and see what we have so far. The next thing we can add is spacing between each element. We can add inner space by using padding, or outer space by using margin. Since we don't want to change the padding inside any of our elements yet, let's change the margin on the bottom by using the margin bottom property. Let's try 10 pixels. Oh, actually, it looks like 20 pixels is a better fit. Since the footer class is included in our list and it doesn't need a bottom margin, let's set its margin bottom property to 0. Perfect. Now let's set the spacing inside our elements. To do that, we use the padding property. The padding property also uses a shorthand, which is top, right, bottom, left. Or if you only use one value, it's used for all 4. We use 20 pixels here. However, in the footer and menu, we have less padding. Let's reference those classes and give them no padding for now. Next, we'll address our items that have centered content, those being the header, the nav menu, and the footer. Here we center them by using the text align property and setting it to center. Alright, things are looking a lot like the wireframe. Next, let's style our nav menu, which is an unordered list. Browsers give lists different margin and padding by default, so we'll have to undo that. We'll also have to remove the bullet points, and then we'll have to set the list item style to inline so they appear right next to each other. To do that, we'll reference the menu class, but this time we're going to reference a child of the menu class, which is the unordered list element. Let's use the list style property and set it to none to get rid of our bullets. Let's remove our default padding. And next, we'll target the list items, which are a child of the unordered list. We set their display property to inline so they aren't on top of each other. Alright, now that our menu items are in line, let's set the color and add the separating bars. For the color, we'll reference the link inside of the list element. And instead of using a hex code, we'll just put the word white in for color. There's a whole list of these color aliases. You can check them out using the link in the description. Save and refresh. The color is changed. We also need to get rid of the underline, so we'll use the text decoration property and set it to none. Now let's add the bars. To do this, we'll use 2 little tricks. The first is to reference the content pseudo element and set it to the vertical bar character. Pseudo elements are ways we can point to specific parts of a referenced element. Note the bars appearing after each list item. Let's add a little spacing by adding a margin to the left of each bar. But we don't want the last bar, so we use the second trick, referencing the last list item child and unsetting the content pseudo element for it. And also unsetting the margin. Next, we'll change the color of the vertical bar by setting its color to white. Save and refresh. Great. One thing you'll probably notice is that we haven't set the font yet, and we'll add that a bit later. For now, let's change the color of all of our text to white, starting with the header H1 element. Then we'll color the rest of our items by adding them to another comma-separated list. Save and refresh, and there we go. Now we can set our font. Of course, you can do this in several ways, but for our purposes here, let's go to Google Fonts and learn how to quickly add a beautiful font to our page. Let's open up a new tab, go to fonts.google.com. To select a font, we browse for the one we want and click on it. I'm after Roboto here, so I'll select that. I'll go through and select all of the font weights I want to use. You can select as many or as few as you actually use. No need to load extra. Then we copy the little code snippet into our index.html right before our existing link reference. After that, inside of our style.css, we'll set our font family to use the new font. Save and refresh. Perfect. Now we're a lot closer to where we want to be. Of course, now we've got to attend to some of the details like making sure our font is set at the right points, the padding is right, etc. Let's update the font size for our nav menu for starters. Save and refresh that. Looks like 20 might be a better fit here, so let's set it to 20 pixels. Good. And of course, it looks like I forgot to put dev in the footer here. You probably caught that way before I did, but let's change that. The font weight in the top header is a little heavy, so let's use something lighter. You can, of course, go through the list of font weights you selected on Google Fonts to get a sense for what will match your design best, but I happen to know 400 is pretty close to what I want, so I'll try that. Now it looks like the nav menu doesn't have our font applied, so let's add that into our existing comma-separated list. And next we'll adjust our padding around the nav menu. We'll do that using padding, padding top, and padding bottom 5 pixels. Let's try a bit more. After a bit of playing with it, I forgot I'd set the margin and padding further down the CSS file, so we set it here and it should show up as expected. I used the shorthand for top, bottom, left, right padding here and set the top, bottom to 5 pixels and it works as intended. Next, let's adjust the padding in our content area. After some head scratching, I remembered I set the padding for the content class lower in the CSS file. Remember, rules that get loaded later have higher precedence. Again, the top and bottom here are set to 0, and the left and right here are set to 20 pixels. And I do that using the same shorthand syntax as before. Next, let's set the padding on the footer. Here I just referenced the footer class and set the padding to 5 pixels and 0 pixels respectively, then put it at the bottom of the CSS file. Okay, we're almost done here, so let's compare our wireframe and design side by side. It looks like we need to adjust the font size of the footer text, so let's do that next. Looks like 20 pixels is a little big, so let's take it back down to 18 pixels. 16. Actually, 18 looks better. Next, our font weight for our H2 tag and our content is a little big, so let's adjust that. So we'll reference it using the content class H2. We'll try some different font weights here until we get the one that matches. And let's also set our font size until we get the one that looks like the closest match. And that about does it. There are some things we can do to clean this up, of course, like grouping some of the class references. I also like to alphabetize my properties. And of course, there's a ton more to learn about CSS in general. But if you're just starting out, this is a great basic template to build on. If you found this helpful, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe for more tutorials like this one. I release content like this multiple times per week, so click the bell if you want to get notified when those are out. But until next time guys, this is Scott from C Scott Dev, and I'll see you in the next one.